Welcome to a special edition of the Emerging Civil War podcast. Joining me today is my good friend Curt Fields, who will be portraying Ulysses S. Grant. Curt and I are working on a book project where Curt will lay out the life of Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War. And as part of our discussions, we thought we'd share some of that biographical material with you today. So I'm going to ask Curt to put on his metaphorical U.S. Grant hat. He'll be speaking to us as Grant to tell us a little bit about Grant's early life and career. General Grant, so glad to have you with us.
Ms. Mackowski, it's good to join you this day. You find me in my tent. It's the 8th of April of 1862. Shiloh, the Armageddon that it was fought for the last 2 days. The field is now quiet except for the groans of the wounded that are still there and the burial parties that are beginning to do the grim work that they've got to do. My early numbers that I'm getting are that there are some approaching 4,000 dead on the field and 24,000 total casualties, but there are nearly 4,000 dead Americans on this field. And after such an event, I'm called to mind to reflect not only on the battle, but how I came to be here. And the odyssey for me, the tumultuous times in my life in this first year or so of the war matched the tumultuous times in the country with the war. I was in great fear that I would not be able to get into the war. And only by the hardest and some good fortune, I was offered the command of the 21st Illinois Infantry, and I accepted that command, and that's dated, for those who keep up with such matters, for June the 15th of 1861. And just 7 weeks later, when I was in Missouri, I was made aware that on July the 30th, President Lincoln had recommended me and some other officers to be brigadier generals of volunteers. And then on August the 9th, just scant days later, the Senate approved the nomination, and I was a brigadier general of volunteers after just 7 weeks of the war and had not really done anything. I met my first challenge as commanding officer of a regiment when we were going after a Missouri militiaman, Tom Harris, but he had skedaddled before we got there. And I learned a most valuable lesson. I realized that the enemy was just as afraid of me as I was of him. And that was a valuable lesson. It was a view of the matter I'd never taken, but I never forgot it either. And I will not forget it. Then I was transferred to Cairo, Illinois, on the Mississippi River, and reported to command the area of southeastern Missouri and other environs. I think the orders, as I recall, read in so much as I could extend my command, which is at best vague. And when I got there, the day I got there on September the 4th, I was approached by Mr. d'Arnaud, a spy from Memphis, who told me that 4,000 Confederate soldiers under Leonidas Polk were marching out of Columbus, Kentucky to take Paduca, Kentucky. Well, that would not do, because at Paduca, Kentucky, there is the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio, and very nearby, the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. All four of those rivers come together in just a few miles of each other. And he who holds Paduca can have a chokehold on the war south of Paduca, Kentucky. So I immediately ordered a movement to go to Paduca, just a few miles away from Cairo. And I said, hearing no orders to the contrary. This was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon on the 5th, and I didn't hear any orders to the contrary until I got back. But we took Paduca, Kentucky, and secured it for the Union. Now, remember, Kentucky is neutral. As I say, we secured it for the Union. Well, it was already in the Union. However, Leonidas Polk had violated Kentucky neutrality when he marched in and took Columbus, Kentucky, south of Paducah. And I was merely protecting it for the Union. And after we secured Paducah, I came back to Cairo. And we had a period of inactivity after that stretched almost 2 months. A lot of drilling, a lot of essentially the camp of the soldier for the troops, the thousands of troops that were gathering there at Cairo. Most of them, nearly all of them, had been civilians, some of them but days before they got to Cairo. They didn't know the manual of arms. They did not know how to be a soldier. And I spent my time busily at Cairo with my office in the second floor of the bank building, with my desk in the rear of the building, where I could see everything that as people came in. People thought I wasn't watching, but I smoked my pipe, my church warden pipe, long stem, and watched what was happening. And then we got word from John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder. He went in the field himself and went down into Missouri, chasing Sterling Price. I sent 3,000 troops under General Richard Oglesby, Colonel Oglesby, in to pursue these troops. Fremont gets involved, and I'm ordered to conduct a demonstration on both sides of the Mississippi River there at Columbus, Kentucky, and then Belmont, Missouri on the west side of the river. I don't like demonstrations. They waste, I think, time. They wear out the men. They wear out the equipment and the animals. I just don't like it, but I followed my orders. But as we're going down toward Columbus, I found out that at Camp Johnston, across the river at Belmont, there was a large Confederate camp and training camp, and they were staging to go into western Missouri, and they're behind those 3,000 troops with Richard Oglesby that I had sent in. And I could not have Oglesby and those 3,000 men trapped with rebels between them and the river. So I decided to take Camp Johnston. And again, hearing no orders to the contrary, I moved, and on the morning of November the 7th, we attacked Belmont, Missouri, Camp Johnston. Well, it was about a 4-hour fight, and it was, in my reflections, I think of how much I learned that day. A couple of things happened that won't happen again, I assure you. I sent a couple of the 2 boats that came down, the Tyler and the Lexington, I think, gunboats, to watch Columbus, Kentucky, up on those 200, I think, foot bluffs and be a buffer. I sent a regiment down the river south of where we landed to go to Belmont and ordered the colonel, stay here until you are relieved. I shouldn't have had to tell him that, but he's lately a civilian, didn't know his craft yet. And I said, stay here until you're relieved, because they were going to be a regiment between the Confederates on the bluff and us going to the west into the camp of the Confederates. We fought our way in, serious, fierce fighting. And I want to emphasize, as I reflect, this was my first combat under fire as the commanding officer of the troops. Now, if I'd been second in command, it would have been no problem. But I was in command. Men would fight and die under my decisions, the results. So it was a momentous day for me, but they did well. We took the camp, and then I found out that's when the givens I thought were in place were not. I thought men had more discipline. They did not. They began looting the camp, getting trophies and souvenirs, booty, they were calling it in loot. I couldn't get my officers to stop them because my officers were getting the booty and the loot. And people such as most of the officers, including John McClernand, were dashing from one group to the other, giving speeches about huzzah for the Union and the glory of the Union and so forth. And all of that time, in my dismay over the breakdown of discipline, I'm looking over toward that forest southwest of us where those Confederates had retreated. I knew they were not defeated. I knew they were staging probably for another attack, a counterattack. And at the same time, I'm looking on those bluffs just across the river, and steamboats were coming across that river that were black with troops. I knew there were hard times ahead. And those troops began landing between us and my boats waiting. Belle Memphis was my command boat, in fact. So I ordered some officers burn the tents. And when the tents were set on fire, it got the attention of my troops. And then someone yelled, "We're surrounded." And they were saying, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" The same officers that were just giving hello to the Union are saying, "What are we going to do?" with their voices cracking. And I said, "You fought your way in, you're going to fight your way out." That apparently was a novel idea to them. Remember, we're dealing with men who were civilians weeks ago. I formed them into two columns like an arrow. And on the double quick, went to the Confederates, and we split them asunder like a meat cleaver hitting a steak, and made it to the boats. Now, the Confederates are separated, and they were stunned by what we had done. It was bravado that they were not expecting. And we got to the boats. More steadily coming across the river. We're trying to get back to our boats. When I got to the boat, I remembered I've got that colonel in a regiment south of here, and they may not have been relieved. I put the spurs to my horse and galloped alone. That's another lesson I learned. Don't go anywhere alone. I got to the colonel, or where the colonel should have been, and they were gone. They'd skedaddled. They were back at the boats. Now, during the battle, I've already had a horse shot out from under me and lost some of my equipment and some engraved metalware and accoutrements that I prized, but they're gone. A cooperative lieutenant offered me his mount, and I took it. Well, now I've got the rebels between me and the river, and I began riding the horse through a cornfield that hadn't been harvested yet. You could only see down the rows. And I had on an old Army infantry greatcoat, faded blue, looked like an enlisted man, I hoped. And I tried to blend in with my environment. And I began walking the horse through that cornfield. And two rebel officers, one of them later I found out was Polk himself, yells at the men, "Look, yonder goes a Yankee officer. Practice your marksmanship on him." And I put the spurs to my horse. I knew my ruse had been discovered. Fortunately, while I was no more than 50 yards away from those troops, scores of them, not one man raised a musket. I galloped to the riverbank. Now, it had been the driest river in summer in memory, so the river was very low. There was almost a cliff, almost a vertical cliff on the riverbank. And I got to it and I looked down, boats were pulling away. Now, the commander of the Belle Memphis did see me. The boats are leaving. I'm only the commanding officer. But he cut his engines. Now, he did not come back to the river. He cut his engines. My horse seemed to understand the urgency of the moment and went over the bank with his haunches, even with my head, slid down that bank. The captain ran out a plank. And it's difficult to get a horse to walk on a plank, a wide one even, over water. Again, my mount seemed to understand the urgency of the moment, and he walked across that plank. I got aboard, went up into the captain's cabins behind the pilot house, tried to lie down, but I was too charged to lie. I got up, heard some firing going on, went out on the deck, and some of the Yankees were firing down on our fellows, and our fellows returning fire. And I said, stop that nonsense, you're out of range. And then I went back into the cabin, and I noted the captain told me it's not the wall, it's the bulkhead. I noticed in the bulkhead where my head would have been was a hole in the wall bulkhead. I'd have taken a ball through the head had I not gotten up. But there are those that say I lost the Battle of Belmont. I would dispute that. I accomplished all of my purposes. The rebels did not send anybody in behind Oglesby. They did not reestablish Camp Johnston, and they made no further movement either into the interior or north of Columbus. So I would, and my men got their first taste of combat. They were blooded. And had I gone back to Cairo without fighting them, it would have been, I think, they thought, showing the white feather, and would have been demoralizing to them. So I'm glad I did it. I accomplished all of the goals that I had established for the Battle of Belmont. But we go into another period of inactivity, and then in February, late January, I proposed to move on Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. I asked to see General Halleck about it. After my third or fourth telegram to him, he finally relented and said, well, come on up and talk. Tell me what you've got in mind. And I say it with that tone of voice because that was his demeanor. I went up to St. Louis. I met with him, and I began to explain the import of Columbus, of the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River because of the strategic criticality of it. And I hadn't gotten but a few sentences out of my mouth before General Halleck dismissed me. Well, that'll be enough. That'll be all, General. Thank you very much. You may return to your command. And I stepped back in shock. I thought perhaps I'd said something unmilitary. But I certainly didn't think I had put my idea forth in an acceptable manner to convince General Halleck to act on my recommendations, my urging, not just suggestion. And I returned to Cairo. I had become good friends with Andrew Hull Foote, Commodore Foote, and I'd like to point out that he's the Navy's first admiral, rear admiral. They created the rank for him because he said, I'm dealing with a general and I'm a captain. A Commodore was a title. I need to be on a rank commensurate with the brigadier general. So Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy, said, you're absolutely right. And they created the rank of rear admiral, and Foote became the first rear admiral. I always smile when I think of that, but Foote liked the idea, and he did not like the inactivity. He had these 7 ironclads, these brand new weapons that nobody knew what to do with. In fact, 3 of them were under Army command. They were all under Army command, in essence, because Wells didn't know what to do with them. And he said, well, let the Army do it. And I don't think that happened again. But Foote suggested to Halleck that we approach Forts Henry and Donelson. And then Halleck began getting some other information too. And when Foote double tapped him behind my recommendations, he agreed for us to try to take Henry and Donelson. Henry is a brief tale. It was a fort built right on the bank of the Tennessee River, high bluff opposite it on the eastern side, Fort Hyman. It deserves little mention because it was never finished. It was going to have fire raining down on anybody attacking Fort Henry, but the rebels never finished that. Fort Henry was right on the water. And in fact, nobody apparently thought about the river rising with the winter snows and heavy rains. And Fort Henry was about 18 to 24 inches deep in water. So we approached that. I was going to go around on the land side and come around from the east and then come up from the southeast. And Foote was going to take the gunboats in and attack them from the water, which he did, demolished the fort, and Lloyd Tillman surrendered it. Now, Tillman, who was a native of Paduca, Kentucky, Tillman had already sent I think 3,000 men to Fort Donelson, which is only 12 miles away from Fort Henry. And he kept a skeleton crew with him to man the guns, and all he was doing was a delaying movement. But the fort was just destroyed. In fact, Tillman and his officers had to row out in a boat to surrender the fort. By the time we got there, I was with John McClernand. Because of all the rains, the mud had been so deep in the Tennessee riverside, countryside, that we were about 3 hours, I think, as I recall, longer than we meant to. And the Navy had already taken the surrender, which was fine with me. I have nothing but praise for the United States Navy. It did not chagrin me at all that Andrew Hull Foote was able to take that victory. And I immediately sent a telegram to General Halleck that said, we have taken Fort Henry, and I will advance and take Fort Donelson on February the 8th. I learned then, don't send your commanding officer prophetic messages that may not come to pass. Because as it turned out, because of the mud and the weather and the terrain, I didn't even get to begin moving until February the 8th. Now, one should know that from the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, you've got Fort Henry east, and then you got Fort Donelson further to the west, rather, Fort Donelson's east. There are only 12 miles between those two forts, with the outer lines of Fort Henry coming back to the east and the outer lines of Fort Donelson coming to the west. There's only a narrow strip of 2 or 3 miles between those two forts that's not covered at that time, patrolled by enemy troops. There are 2 roads. There's a ridge road and the telegraph road that go, and then they parallel, and then they come together right at Fort Donelson. I divided the army and we're marching. Didn't take long, or shouldn't have taken long to get there, but the mud's pretty deep. And the weather, as it turned out, broke. Now, all of those Midwestern boys that were in that army, most of whom had never been south, they thought that the balmy 60-degree weather, some say as high as 70, and sunshine, they thought that's wintertime down south. And they began shedding those greatcoats, those new greatcoats, and blankets and so forth. Now, I know the journalists have it that we were discarding them on the side of the road. I should like very much to correct that. Nothing was thrown on the side of the road. Companies would gather their coats and blankets and assign usually one of the older men, or who was not necessarily a good combatant, to guard the blankets and the coats. They moved on. Well, on the 12th, we invested or began probing around Donelson, the outer works near the water batteries. And on the 13th, we had some heavy engagement, primarily due to John McClernand. I put out the orders not to bring on an engagement. Well, McClernand, who is close to the center of the line, has a rebel battery firing at him. And as he said, I think I'm quoting him, it irritated me. Well, he sends out somebody to address that issue, and then he sends more troops. So it turned out it was Maney's battery for the Confederates. And then there's a Confederate infantry response, and John McClernand very nearly brought on a battle that I was not prepared to fight. Now, we were able to put that fire out, and I spoke with General McClernand about that. I was hoping in my overall approach that even though we had invested the outer lines of the Confederates from north of the fort on the Cumberland River all the way down south and to the southern end, we had encased them from the riverside. Now there's a fort, and then there's Dover, Tennessee behind the fort. And I was hoping that Foote could do the same thing to the water batteries there at Fort Donelson that he'd done to the water batteries at Fort Henry, and so did Andrew Hull Foote. So in the afternoon of February the 14th on Valentine's Day, Foote steams up with his ironclads. As I recall, he had 5 ironclads and 2 timberclads that were behind the ironclads, some 7 boats. And they steamed up to within, I think the admiral told me 900 feet, about 1,000 feet from the batteries, point blank. And there were 32-pound and 64-pounder guns in Donelson. They had brought in, I understand, rebel artillery gunners who were not your normal enlisted man. These fellows were experts. And they, Admiral Foote said in his report that they took, I think his command boat, the Carondelet, took 56 hits between wind and water below the water line. And in the vernacular of some of the sailors, those rebel gunners wore them out. All of his ironclads were disabled except one. Rudders, rudder ropes, lines shot away, and it was a resounding defeat for Hull, Admiral Hull Foote. So he backed up. Now that they exchanged their Iron Valentines on the 14th, and as I saw them steam back down the Cumberland, my heart sank because I realized this is going to have to be a siege. I did not want a siege. I did not want to have to go through that. The next morning, early on the 15th, about 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, Foote sent for me. Now, I left orders on the field. Don't bring on an engagement. Now, what I did not do, and I learned a lesson, I did not leave anyone in command. I just left those orders, very heavy orders, don't bring on an engagement. I went to meet Admiral Foote. While I am there, the rebels did their famous well, I shouldn't say attempted, they were successful with that breakout. They rolled McClernand back, and it's only by Lew Wallace acting on his own that he came from McClernand's left down and got between McClernand and the Confederates and blocked that melee that was pushing back McClernand. But then Gideon Pillow, in his military wisdom, stopped the attack and went back into the Confederate lines. Now, Buckner, who is the only professional general, Simon Bolivar Buckner, we went to the academy together. Buckner is outraged. What are you doing? Well, Pillow said, I accomplished my objective. I pushed them back and opened up the road to Nashville, Tennessee, the escape route. And then he went back in his lines, which gave Lew Wallace and McClernand time to regroup. When I got off the boat from Admiral Foote, I've got a messenger who's just ashen-faced waiting for me. He said, there's a terrible battle going on, and you've got to get there right now. Well, I'm about 7 miles away from the battle, and it had dropped, the weather had dropped to about 10 below zero overnight. The ground was hard frozen, sheet of ice covered the ground, and a horse has 4 legs and iron hoof shoes. They're very careful to walk, so I couldn't get in a hurry. When I finally got to the battlefield, I made a decision that some say is the pivotal decision of the war. I can't say that. That's for history to determine. It's not for me to say. But I went to Sudley Hill there where McClernand and Wallace were, and they were sitting their horses, and I rode up to them, and McClernand snarled at me and said, "This army wants a general." And that was his greeting, his salutation. And I had a piece of paper in my hand, and my aide described it later. He said, General Grant stiffened, reddened from the neck up, and crushed the paper in his hand at his side, but said nothing. And then leaned forward and said, "Gentlemen, that ground must be retaken." I told my aide with me, the men were standing around, milling about. They were out of ammunition, crates of ammunition everywhere. And I told my staff, tell the men, fill your cartridge boxes, get back in line. We must retake this ground. The rebels cannot be allowed to have the ground. And I put the spurs to my horse, but I said to my aide, don't gallop, walk your animal, because the rebels are watching us, and I want no sign of panic or even consternation. So we went back north to our left. Wallace and McClernand are reorganizing, refilling cartridge boxes. And I went to Charles Ferguson Smith. He'd been my commandant of students when I first went to West Point. First man officer I met in the administration building, and told me I wasn't going to get my name changed back to what it should be, Hiram Ulysses Grant. He said, "Mr. Grant, by God, the Army says your name is Ulysses S. Grant, and Ulysses S. Grant you are. Or do you have any questions?" And I said, "No, sir. You are dismissed." "Yes, sir." And that's how I became Ulysses S. Grant. There's more to it, but that's another time. But now General Smith under my command, and I had some angst over this, because to me, he was a military saint, my patron saint. He was my mentor. I thought the world of him because he deserved it. He was a soldier's soldier. And I told him in private, I have some problems with being your commanding officer. And being the soldier, some 40 years by then, he said, "Grant, I'm a soldier and so are you. Give me orders as you see fit and I will follow them. Think no more of it." And I said, "Yes, sir." He made it clear. But I rode up to General Smith, who was sitting on the ground, leaning back up against a tree. And I said, "General Smith, you must take the enemy works." As it turned out, it was Buckner's works that he was attacking. And the ground looks like God took a blanket and pushed it together. There are rivulets and gullies and hills and rills. It's all up or down and heavily wooded. And Smith, true to who he was, he slapped his knees and he said, "I'll do it." And he unfolded like a carpenter's rule. He was well over 6 feet tall and skinny as a rail, and stood up, and he turned and yelled to his volunteers, "Come on, you volunteers. You volunteered to die for your country, and today's a good day to do it." Got on his horse and rode his horse and led his troops in combat. Now, one soldier wrote in his, I think it was in his diary, might have been a letter, but he said, "I had lost heart until I saw General Smith on his horse with his long mustache, his white mustache, flowing over his shoulder." Now, that must have been a long mustache. I don't recall it that long, but this trooper was behind him and said General Smith's white mustache was flowing over his shoulder. But they took the works, they pushed it back. Buckner fell back, and night fell. Now, it's so cold that the dead were freezing to the ground. The wounded were freezing to the ground. When stretcher bearers came through, they were having to cut the hair of the dead or wounded that had frozen to the ground. And one instance that I saw, there was a wounded Confederate soldier and a federal officer, and they were both wounded, possibly, if not probably mortally, both of them. And the officer was trying to get his canteen to give the Confederate soldier a drink. The stretcher bearers came up and they picked up the officer, the federal officer, and began to move away. And I said, no, him too. And they turned and looked, and I said, pick up the Confederate and take him back for medical treatment too. The war is over for both of them. Take them both. And they did. But I went back to my headquarters, to assess and plan what to do for the next day. And I was at the widow Crisp's house and sitting by the fireplace. Then I went try to get some sleep in that rope bed that she had. And I was awakened deep in the night, early morning, and it was General Smith. And he had brought me, he said, I've got a message for you from Buckner, who's now in command. John Floyd passed it to Pillow passed it to Buckner, and Buckner was left holding the bag. And he said, I'll suffer the fate of my men. The other two men skedaddled. Well, he was asking for terms and commissioners. And I read it. And now you must understand the geography of this. There's a small fireplace, and I'm sitting in that caneback chair in front of the fireplace reading the note. And Ferguson Smith is standing next to me, and he is towering over me. So you've got fireplace, me, and Smith in a line. The geography, it still stays with me. And I looked up at him and I said, what do you think, General? He said, Bob, no terms to the damned rebels except unconditional surrender. And I said, that sounds good. Bring me pencil and paper. So I'd like to claim the unconditional surrender, but General Smith gets it. As it turned out, we surrendered. They surrendered, rather, and I took Donelson. 17 to 20,000 soldiers, depends on who you're counting or who's doing the counting. And many of them walked off during the night because, again, I'm learning lessons. I didn't put up pickets and sentries out to guard the prisoners. And Bushrod Johnson, Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson, walked into the woods, lived to fight another day, many days, in fact. And I was busy with all the surrender activities. Then as soon as I could get clear, I wanted to go into Clarksville. I told Halleck we can take Clarksville by the 25th. I think I told him of February, and then we'll take Nashville. And I moved into Clarksville. Bull Nelson had brought in several thousand troops to reinforce me. I didn't need them then. And I sent them on into Nashville. They took Nashville. The city officials surrendered, in essence, to Nelson. I went on into, I telegraphed Halleck and said, I'm going into Nashville, which was in my command. What I didn't know at the time was that a rebel telegrapher had gotten between me and Cairo. And he was not delivering all the messages, my daily reports. He was altering messages, and he skedaddled and took a lot of information with him. But when I met with Buell, urging to take Nashville. He was hesitant, reluctant to take it. In fact, he had the mayor and board of aldermen row across the river to Edgefield, Tennessee, to surrender to him there. Because if he come on into Nashville, when he set boot on the ground, he'd have been under my command in my district, and he refused to do that. Well, he took the surrender of Nashville ultimately, and it fell. It was a rich prize to get, moral impact and value for us. Confederate capital, state capital falling, the rail junction there, tremendous distribution center. So it was it was a significant victory. So now we've got the Cumberland River, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and that flow went all the way to Chattanooga. That was a sword in the belly of the Confederacy. When Donelson fell, the Cumberland River went straight into Nashville. That was a dagger in the heart of the Confederacy. When I got back to Clarksville, I have information got there on March the 4th, I believe it was. And I got information, go back to Fort Henry, give command of your army to Charles Ferguson Smith, and send them down to Eastport, Mississippi, to burn the rail junction, the bridge there. Now, Eastport is close to just a few miles south of Pittsburgh Landing, which is 7 miles south of Savannah, Tennessee. So you've got Savannah, Pittsburgh Landing, and then Eastport was a critical railroad bridge. And I'm to send my army south, upriver, because the Tennessee's flowing north there. This is going south. And I'm not in command. So I repaired back to Fort Henry on my command boat. I'm not under arrest, although I'm hearing rumors that my court-martial papers have already been prepared. I'm not relieved of command. I'm still commanding general, Army of the Tennessee, but I'm standing on the dock, in essence, waving goodbye to the Army as they board boats and go upriver down south to Pittsburgh Landing. General Smith was wont to do that, but I told him, follow your orders. And I've gone from being in headlines across the country of winning the first significant victory of the war for the federal cause. I've taken 17,000 Confederates out of the field, captured, I think, 120 guns. It's been a signal achievement. And within days, and I got promotion to Major General of Volunteers. So my 1-star will become 2, and the Senate quickly approved that. So I've all these good things have happened, yet I'm sitting on my command boat at Fort Henry wondering, no army, no command. I'm in the dark of what's happened, who's done it, or why they've done it, and I'm in limbo. We'll have to wait and see what happens. I hope I fare well in this, but at that point, I didn't know.
Let me turn my unmute. General Grant, it is April 8th. We do know that things are going to probably turn out okay for you, but we will leave our listeners on that little bit of a cliffhanger and let you bring us up to speed on what has happened in the weeks since then on our next episode. I want to thank you for taking some time to chat with us and fill us in about your early exploits in the war. This has just been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with me, General Grant, and our mutual friend, Curt Fields. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.